Now we hope Paolo de Castro has joined us live. Hello, good morning to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Good morning everybody, and thank you, Secretary, thank you, McKinney, to have me. Nice to see you both.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your speech. Well, let's start our debate now. Mr. Gove, first of all, could you just confirm, I'm sure a lot of people have been reading the papers this morning, you didn't actually mention that year date 2024 specifically in your speech. If you could confirm that for us. We also have a question from someone on the app which says, how will you ensure that by extending farm support until 2024, UK farmers don't lose out to their EU counterparts who will see significant reforms in 2020?
Well, the first thing to say is that the use of words like transition and implementation can be sometimes misheard by certain audiences. Let me try to clarify. Firstly, exactly as Paolo mentioned, we want to have a 2-year transition period from the point at which, or more or less 2-year transition period, from the point at which we formally leave the European Union in March 2019. Michel Barnier has suggested, and Paolo confirmed, that there's a certain logic from the point of view of the EU in saying that that should be 21 months long rather than 24 months. So that the UK is in that transition period right up until the 31st of December 2020. And in that transition period, we abide by and respect the rules of the European Union. There may be 1 or 2 areas where there are wrinkles and where there's not perfect alignment, but broadly, we respect the rules even though we don't have representation as we prepare to depart. Now, the second thing is the commitment that we've made overall on cash for the level of support that UK farmers will enjoy. And we've said that irrespective of when that transition period in itself ends, we will continue to provide the same amount that is currently provided under the Common Agricultural Policy in cash terms for UK farmers right up until 2022. And what I propose, and what our command paper will say more about, is that we will also continue to provide people with BPS payments for a further UK-specific, agriculture-specific transition period beyond 2022. And I envisage that should be around 5 years from the end of the existing BPS in 2019. So that's 5 years when we have broadly the same amount with a cap. And how that cap will operate, whether it will be a hard cap or whether we progressively reduce higher amounts, again, is a matter for consultation. The reason why I mentioned 5 years is that it seems to me to be a good starting point for a debate about how we can balance the need to give people the flexibility they need in order to make that transition, while at the same time not perpetuating a state of affairs whereby people rely on an existing form of subsidy and think that the new world will never dawn. Final thing that I would say, just following on from the question there, is, of course, when you talk about being disadvantaged relative to EU colleagues, disadvantage is in the eye of the beholder. Now, again, as Paolo has pointed out, it will be the case that the Common Agricultural Policy will be reformed and certain reform propositions have been put forward. But it's already the case that across the EU27 we see different views about how the CAP might develop. One of the things that I expect is that there will still be some form of area-based payment existing within the EU after it's been phased out in the UK. Now, some people might say that's an advantage for the EU. I would argue, as I argued in my remarks earlier today, that's actually an advantage for the UK in allowing us to use our agricultural support funding in a way which incentivises greater productivity and provides a greater level of environmental enhancement. But I recognise, of course, that good people can disagree about whether or not that is an advantage or a disadvantage to UK farmers. I think it's a significant advantage and look forward to hearing from people about how we can make it work even better.
We have a question from the floor here now, if we could get a microphone to Jim Pace, I believe. Hello. Stephen Feld. Sorry, I can't see. The lights are bright in my eyes. I'm so sorry. Same hairdo, yeah.
Stephen Fell, Yorkshire farmer and Leaf. Secretary of State, you expect me to applaud you for what you said about combining productive and innovative agriculture with environmental enhancements. with the right stimuluses, and we look forward to hearing about those. But however, as I believe exports will become a vital part of developing sustainable British agriculture in a global marketplace, how are you going to coordinate other government departments, BEIS and DIT, to ensure that we're not sidelined in any export strategy? And how can you assist aspiring agricultural export businesses, bearing in mind that the highest standards such as leaf mark, which you mentioned, will be an essential to market entry?
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Stephen. There are a number of things there. It's not just other government departments that can help. The Oxford Farming Conference has helped by making sure that Ted and I can have conversations about the vital importance of respecting the interests of both our agri-food sectors in any future trade deal and any future relationship. But more broadly, thinking about government, one of the things that I tried to do in the speech was to stress that agriculture shouldn't be seen in isolation in policy terms. We should put agriculture at the heart of our broader approach towards food and drink manufacturing and export. And that's why in the Industrial Strategy White Paper, we talked about the creation of a Food and Drink Sector Council and the development of a Food and Drink Sector deal. And the reason for that is precisely because I want to get all of government working together in order to ensure that our most successful manufacturing sector and our fastest growing becomes even more successful. I want to make sure that everyone feels that they have skin in the game. And that's also why in the area of my speech about food, I talked about the commitment that Liam Fox has made to make British food and drink his top priority when it comes to trade conversations and negotiations during the course of this year, and also why I mentioned the role that the Department for Health can play as well, because I want to have the maximum buy-in across government for an approach towards making the most of British food. And I think that there's no tension between saying that our food is produced to the very highest standards, as the leaf mark reinforces, and being economically successful, because I think for Britain, other countries may make a different decision. For Britain, we want to compete at the top of the value chain, and therefore building a reputation for the healthiest, most nutritious, highest quality food with the highest standards of animal welfare helps badge us as the best of the best.
Let's take a question over here, please.
Hello, Andrew McShane from Hutchinson's Agronomy Business. A question for Secretary of State. I was very pleased to hear the support for the no-till agriculture approach, and also very interested to hear Mr McKinney's comments on false erection of phytosanitary barriers to trade. Now, bearing in mind the importance of glyphosate in terms of no-till agriculture, and bearing in mind the shambles we've seen on the recent 5-year extension of glyphosate approval, will the Secretary of State be looking forward to taking the opportunity of Brexit to introduce a science-based regulatory regime for crop protection products and other inputs into UK agriculture?
Very briefly. Yeah.
Yes, is the short answer. More broadly, I think that Ted and I were talking about glyphosate last night, and one of the things that we recognise that it's an invaluable tool in making sure that actually you can have more environmentally sustainable methods of cultivation, which help to protect and enhance soil quality. Now, in the future, it may be that there are technical breakthroughs that allow us to apply interventions like glyphosate with an even lighter touch, and that will be a good thing. But ultimately, we need to take a science and risk-based approach to making sure that farmers have the tools that they need in order to farm productively, and glyphosate is part of that, and it needs to remain part of it. And of course, there were discussions at an EU level about reauthorising them. One thing I want to say is that even though we're leaving the EU, I'm full of admiration for Phil Hogan, the current Agriculture Commissioner, for the way in which, after some mid-air turbulence, he managed to land this, this particular policy very well.
Can I bring in Paolo de Castro on that? I mean, it took a long time, didn't it, to get a decision backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards.
Yeah, let me say first of all that I would like to underline again that we are totally agreeing with the Secretary Gove that we want to free tariff access. We don't want to make any difficulty on the trade between UK, between European Union, of course. But the risk on the table is not the negotiation between us, but it could be the negotiation between UK and the rest of the world. Because in your trade agreement, when you will do other other agreement with other countries in the world, if you are not totally aligned with the European standards, that would be a problem in the future, and there would be the difficulty how to manage this. And this is, for example, the case of the gentleman asked before about glyphosate. I totally agree that we should be on the scientific basis. This is for sure. But anyway, when you will make such agreement with other countries, if you are not totally aligned with the European standards and European rules, of course there will be problems. And this is one thing that we are worried about the future. So let's go, of course, on the common agricultural policy. And I believe that the direction we have done on the last midterm review, what we call omnibus, is exactly the direction that you mentioned in your speech, Mike. Because what we want to do is not only simplification, which is, of course, we need more simplification, but we need more flexibility to adapt the environmental measure. And this is the idea of what we call the menu. So the country, the member state, can choose the best measure to apply and to have a better result on the environment. Because we agree with you that the greenings didn't work well. This is what the Court of Auditors already said. And we want to modify in the future to be flexibility, to give more environment, but at the same time, let me say to UK farmers, we don't want to transform common agricultural policy in common environmental policy. We should maintain the farmers in the center of our policy. We should maintain the competitiveness of farmers. We need to produce more because the people need more food. We need to have such more productive farmers in our countries. So the balance between environmental and economic should be very focused. Otherwise, the risk is to destroy what we achieved in 40 and 50 years of this policy, and we don't get much result of the environment.
Mr. Castro, thank you very much indeed. Do we have a question for Ted McKinney specifically from anyone?
Yes.
Yeah, as well. I was very interested also in your two-way street trade.
Sure.
You know, and I think that links in as well. Very briefly.
Let me address the gentleman's questions. Glyphosate is one of the safest products ever invented in the crop protection chemical area, and it is a darn near crime that it's been villainized in the manner that it has. Now, we can point at all kinds of different reasons as to why, but I'd say they're all, or nearly all, unfortunate. And so I think that is perhaps one of the best examples of where Brexit can stand up and say enough with policies that villainize incredibly good and valuable products. And by the way, not just for farmers, but for consumers and homeowners alike. At least that's the experience that I've had. You asked about sanitary, phytosanitary. Well, with the WTO came very strict rules on how trade should be handled around the world. And a good thing, I might add. I think the WTO, with all its frustrations, has been a very, very good thing for the world. But with the advent of the WTO, with very strict rules, there entered into the equation these sanitary, phytosanitary barriers where protectionist tendencies could find their way in under the guise of food safety and environment and so forth. Okay, I respect that. We take great pride in our farming and ag community about food safety and the environment and animal welfare, all of that. Very, very, very important. But we cannot let that become a means for interference with trade. So we'll be watching with great interest how you work on that, Mr. Secretary. Great deal of interest.
Very much.
You won't be alone.
Thank you. I think we'll find a good way forward.
You mentioned, Mr. Gove, that you were hoping that people will be able to fill in a form, say, for countryside stewardship
Yes.
from between 9 and 6.
Essentially.
There is a question here. How can farmers sit down to the computer and complete an application for a stewardship scheme in a day when rural broadband is still an issue for many?
Well, a very, very good point. The test is a test for the team at RPA and Natural England, to which they've risen so far very well, which is simplify, simplify, simplify. And so it's you know, I'm talking about laboratory conditions here, where you can have, if you can imagine such a thing, a clear run and an uncluttered 8 hours or so in order to complete everything that's required. That's the test, that's the standard to which I'm holding people in those agencies. But the broader point about broadband is well made. One moment during the last year when I'm afraid I burst out laughing spontaneously and rather perhaps inappropriately when I was listening to the radio was when I heard that the traditional guy in a bonfire in Devon had been replaced by a BT open-reach van. And, but my colleague Matt Hancock, as someone who represents a rural constituency that itself has suffered from poor broadband, is really shaking things up in this area. And there is much more that we can do. And I recognise that so much of what I talk about in terms of either simplifying administration or improving access to technology depends upon that infrastructure. It's critical. We have to be held to account over the next year or two about how we improve that.
Thank you very much. We are really short of time. I'm sorry about we started late. We have a question here on the side. There's a microphone coming to you.
Thank you. Sarah Bell, farmer from Oxford Farming Conference, Emerging Leader. Warm words, Mr. Gove, and much appreciated. But I would like to ask you, is it time for a digital strategy for UK agriculture? And how can government start to support that in pulling together what is a fairly disparate system of data movement at the moment?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And one thing that I could have mentioned in the speech is that and I just touched on briefly, is yes, we brought in a team from a data analytics company called ASI to look at how Defra uses data. There were some significant steps forward under Liz Truss, my predecessor, but there's still a lot more that we can do. And I alluded briefly to the fact that when it comes to export health certificates, and this may become an even bigger issue, of course, as we leave the EU, we still have a situation where the advice that we give to people issuing export health certificates requires them to have carbon paper in order to produce copies. It's from another age, literally. The recommendations from ASI they're quite complex and detailed, but they do give us an opportunity for us to use the data that we collect in a much better and more integrated fashion. And I was chatting to Minette Batters last night about precisely this. Minette makes the point that if you look at some other jurisdictions like Australia, they can provide much more information to the consumer and to others about the traceability, the quality, the nature of production, and it also allows decision makers and policy makers, not just in government, to think hard about future investment. We've got to go further in this area, and I hope to say a little bit more about some of the recommendations that ASI have made and some of the changes that we hope to make in order to bring about precisely the sort of changes that you allude to.
Thank you very much. We have a question around the corner here. Sorry, I couldn't see you behind the podium.
Secretary of State, thank you. Edward Morehouse. I'm an MBA student at the Royal Ag University Business School. You mentioned soil management with less inputs quite a few times in your speech, and once productivity actually in the same sentence. And in preserving the former, soil, and boosting the latter, productivity, are you advocating adoption post-19 and CAP of GM seed technology?
No, I'm not. But one of the things that I do believe is that ultimately, as the Cranfield study suggests, the incentives have been poorly aligned in the past. And they have encouraged, not because farmers want to, but because the system has encouraged them to, in some cases, a short-term approach towards soil health. And what I want to do is to make sure that we have a system that rewards people for making sure that they enhance soil quality, and they recognise that that's not just good for productivity overall, but also good in terms of a natural capital approach towards the environment and towards farming in the future. Now, I alluded to the fact that gene editing in the future could provide all sorts of opportunities. The science is still in its infancy, but I do think that it's important that we regard gene editing as a means of science helping us to do faster what farmers have been doing for generations, which is essentially accelerate the process of breeding and evolution. And I think we should have an open mind about that technology and not allow debates from the past to influence how we look at that technology. And we need to look at it in a properly risk-based way, informed by the science, aware of the potential benefits that it can bring, but also challenging those who are its most prominent advocates to satisfy the public about any concerns that they might have as well.
I have to say we have run out of time now, so thank you very much for your questions on the app and here in the conference hall as well. Thank you very much indeed to Ted McKinney, Michael Gove and Paolo de Castro. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. And thank you all. If you could show your appreciation for our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.